Hi, good evening, everyone. My name is Ed Getz. I'm a professor of urban and regional planning at the Humphrey School and the director of the Center for Urban and Regional Affairs at the University of Minnesota. I'm also the faculty coordinator for the Richard Brustad lecture series. And it is in that capacity that I would like to welcome you all to the third annual lecture in this series. Richard Brustad was an urban planner and real estate developer who led the creation of affordable housing in cities, suburbs, and outstate regions of Minnesota during a 53-year career. During his career, Brustad worked with the U.S. Housing and Home Finance Agency. He was the housing director of the Metropolitan Council of the Twin Cities, the executive director of the Minneapolis Public Housing and Redevelopment Authority, the co-founder of Brighton Development Corporation, and the president of the Community Housing Development Corporation. This annual lecture continues his legacy by serving as a forum for discussing important housing issues facing both the Twin Cities region and the country. And the lecture series and a fellowship for that supports Humphrey School students who are interested in affordable housing. Both were established by Mr. Brustad's business partners, Linda Donaldson and Peggy Lucas, and by the Community Housing Development Corporation in 2017. So we will have the talk. There will be a question and answer period, and then there will be a light reception in the atrium afterwards. So that's sort of the lay of the land for the next hour or so. It is my great pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker, Professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. Dr. Taylor is assistant professor in the Department of African American Studies at Princeton University. She received her PhD from Northwestern University in 2013 and did postdoctoral work at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. She is the author of 3 books. The first, published in 2016 by Haymarket Books, called From #Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. And the second, published 1 year later, titled How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective, also published by Haymarket Books. Both of these are award-winning books. Dr. Taylor's most recent book is called Race for Profit, Black Homeownership and the End of the Urban Crisis, and there are copies for sale outside. This is published by University of North Carolina Press. This one hasn't won an award yet, but it's only been out for about a month, so give it some time. Her writing has appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, the Boston Review, the Paris Review, The Nation, and Souls, a critical journal of Black politics, culture, and society. She is a public intellectual and an expert on housing history, and we are very glad to have her as a speaker in the Brustad Lecture Series. So please join me in welcoming her.
Wow. Hello. Thank you for coming out. Just one quick, I think you got that from my faculty page, which I have not yet updated, but the title of the book has changed. It's Race for Profit, How Banks in the Real Estate Industry Undermined Black Homeownership. I need to update my faculty page. I want to thank the Humphrey School for the invitation and the arrangements getting me here. I also want to especially thank Dr. Getz, whose work on housing issues has been important to my own. So it's always good to be able to come someplace where you can actually meet people who write the books that you like in person. So I'm very glad to be here. I'm going to talk for probably 40 minutes about what I think are the kind of most important aspects of the book in hopes of sparking a conversation. I always offer these talks in the spirit of provocation, in a good way, that hopefully get us to think and talk about things beyond the typical parameters we are expected to discuss them in. Last July, in a now typical spasm of racist vitriol, Donald Trump described the city of Baltimore as a, quote, rat and rodent infested mess that, quote, no human being would want to live in. It was cruel and thinly veiled code invoked to disparage the hardship in Black working class communities within that city. In doing so, it also conveyed a fatalistic disregard for those conditions, while expressing a decided lack of ambition to actually attend to something as serious as rodent infestation. Despite Trump's rhetoric, rat infestation in poor and working class Black communities was not evidence of African American indifference to conditions in their neighborhoods, but rats have always been markers of substandard housing that thrives in the enclosure of segregation. The menace of rats in Black working class neighborhoods in the 1960s also inspired ridicule from mean-spirited white conservatives in government then, and it sparked activism and even uprisings. In August 1967, nearly 2 weeks after riots in Detroit prompted the rare deployment of federal troops in an American city, dozens of demonstrators burst into the chamber of the House of Representatives chanting, "Rats cause riots." Days earlier, Congress had rejected a 2-year, $40 million bill to exterminate rats in inner cities across the country. Protesters sat in the gallery hall for 20 minutes, repeating the slogan, "We want a rat bill," at even higher volumes. The previous attempt at passing the bill had not merely been voted down, but had been ridiculed in the process. A Virginia Republican mocked the legislation to howls of laughter from other white representatives, saying, quote, "Mr. Speaker, I think the rat smart thing for us to do is vote down this rat bill right now." One of his colleagues mocked it as another civil rights bill. No laughing matter for the people who lived in inner cities. Rats were the most visceral example of the unequal living conditions forced onto Black people in mid-century America. In the 1960s, African American media regularly reported on rat attacks on the most vulnerable members of Black urban households, children. Lorraine McTush, a single African American mother, complained to a Chicago Defender reporter that she stayed up most nights because of the rats crawling in her bed, which made her nervous, and the rats in her children's bed, which terrified her. "They get into the bunk beds, and so I sit up all night. I am miserable and afraid." 2 days before his first birthday, little Andre Adams was, quote, chewed to death by a rat while sleeping in his crib. A death so shocking that more than 1,000 African American activists gathered at on Chicago's West Side in protest. One activist recalled the prior summer's deadly riot, saying, "Remember Watts." Describing in grisly detail the infant's remains, he said, quote, "When he lay in his crib, you could see the holes where the rats had chewed. The little finger on his right hand was tied on with a string." Chicago health officials disagreed, claiming that the child died of malnutrition, but nevertheless conceding that rats had fed on the dead baby's body. Civil rights leader Dr. Martin Luther King, who spoke at the hastily organized protest, reminded the crowd, "This is why we are fighting slums in Chicago." Rat infestation in Black neighborhoods was profound. When African-American children in a Chicago neighborhood were given a vocabulary test and asked to identify various familiar objects, more than 60% of them misidentified a rat as a teddy bear. In the aftermath of riots in Philadelphia in 1964, a city commissioned report found that 100% of reported rat bites happened in segregated Black majority neighborhoods. Housing segregation, maintained through a vexing combination of white violence, public policy, and the exclusionary practices of the private sector, ensured the dilapidated and substandard condition of Black housing. These were the evidence of exclusion and enclosure, and they boiled over into the electricity of successive waves of uprisings throughout the 1960s. A Harris poll taken in the summer of 1965 after riots in South Central Los Angeles found housing conditions listed among the top 3 concerns of all Americans. In the weeks after the uprising in Detroit in 1967, a Washington Post poll forcefully linked deteriorating conditions in Black communities with the uprisings. 70% of Blacks attributed rioting to housing conditions. 59% of African Americans said they knew someone living in rat-infested housing. 57% reported holes in their ceilings. 49% said their housing was overcrowded. And 68% reported cockroaches in their homes. In the polls, even 39% of whites said they believed that the condition of Black housing was responsible for the ongoing rioting. By the end of the 1960s, the National Advisory Commission on Civil Disorders, known as the Kerner Commission, had left no doubt that substandard housing, evidenced by rat infestation, was a recurring factor in the annual bouts of riots that roiled American cities throughout the decade. Identifying segregation at the root of those conditions and as a significant source of rage in Black communities, the Commission's findings called for historic changes to American housing policies. A landmark Supreme Court case, Jones versus Mayer, decided just weeks after the passage of the Fair Housing Act in the spring of 1968, drew upon the 1866 Civil Rights Act and the 13th Amendment in comparing housing segregation to slavery, arguing, quote, "When racial discrimination herds men into ghettos and makes their ability to buy property turn on the color of their skin, then it is a relic of slavery." The final piece of the battle to open the U.S. housing market to African Americans came with the Housing and Urban Development Act in August of 1968. The 1968 HUD Act was Lyndon Johnson's last greatest legislative accomplishment. It was a bill planned in collaboration with representatives from private enterprise in what was known as the Kaiser Commission. The businessmen who participated described their promotion of single-family homeownership for poor people as socio-commercial enterprise, or business with a conscience. Johnson described the legislation as the Magna Carta for the cities, but its focus on the market and ownership ensured that it was a bipartisan bill. For decades, federal officials had relied on public housing to shelter poor and low-income people. But by the end of the 1960s, public housing had become politically untenable with endless jousts over its maintenance, location, and inhabitants. Housing for the poor suffered from a mixture of government neglect and shrinking tenancy, a result of the dangerous conditions endured by residents and the constant pressure for such housing to exclude anyone other than the poorest tenants. The HUD Act was a pivot away from the notion of public or state responsibility for housing poor or low-income people. At the heart of the legislation was a low-income homeownership plan that aimed to transform low-income renters into homeowners. Federal officials turned to homeownership as a cheaper program, where the cost of the homes were absorbed by the program participants, while the federal government paid regular subsidies to banks, which kept the state's costs lower than the upfront expenses necessary to develop, build, and manage public housing. These economic concerns also fit with the growing idea that homeownership could stabilize the anger and restiveness coursing through American cities. Freshman Senator Charles H. Percy, a Republican from Illinois, described the benefits of expanding homeownership as a, quote, new dawn of opportunity on which a new national effort to bring dignity and a better life to today's slum dweller must be based. We can democratize our cities. We can give people of the ghetto a piece of the action, let them be somebody and achieve something. Richard Nixon said of the bill, quote, people who own their own homes don't burn their neighborhoods. Rather, in pride and self-interest, they turn to fixing up their communities and making them livable for themselves and their neighbors. The terms of the new homeownership program were a low $200 down payment, 20% of a participant's income as their mortgage payment, regardless of the cost of the house, and interest rates capped at 1%. The inclusion of federal mortgage insurance for the first time meant that in the worst case scenario of foreclosure or abandonment, the federal government was obligated to step in and pay back the mortgage, the loan in its entirety to the lender. These terms kept the price of the homes manageable for low-income and working-class people. But it also removed almost all of the risk for the real estate industry. As one official described the program, it's like doing business in heaven. You can't lose money. The unprecedented program linked federal agencies to real estate brokers and mortgage bankers to supply loans for housing to people in neighborhoods that these organizations had previously excluded or redlined. But with the promise of lucrative subsidies and guarantees of mortgage insurance, the promise of profit that came with them, the historic hostility of these private sector forces melted away. But these same conditions also opened new pathways for corrupt real estate practices. Speculators and brokers bought up cheap, dilapidated properties, hoping to flip them for higher prices and sales to people who would qualify for the new programs. The entirety of the program was in the hands of real estate operatives. HUD sent brokers lists of eligible properties. When real estate brokers matched a person with a house, they connected the prospective buyer with a mortgage lender. The mortgage lender consulted with HUD to determine if the person qualified for the program. But at no time did the prospective buyer speak with a representative from the local, state, or federal government. But not only could money be made by flipping cheap properties, brokers found it easy to bribe poorly paid appraisers to inflate the value of the houses in the new urban market. Bankers made money on the front end of the real estate deal by securing the loan in the first place, and then they made money on the back end with expensive closing costs associated with selling property. Everyone made money, except the poor Black families that were disproportionately saddled with these broken homes in cities across the country. The federal government's turn to homeownership was also a consummate expression of post-war racial liberalism, which viewed inclusion into American democracy through the vehicles of citizenship, law, and free market capitalism as the key to unlocking equality and social mobility for Black citizens, just as it had done for white Americans through the New Deal and the GI Bill after World War II. But in narrowing their focus to access alone, racial liberals overlooked the racist practices embedded within these institutions. This was shockingly clear in the real estate industry. Banks and real estate had played the critical role in creating the urban housing crisis, exemplified by the persistence of rats in Black housing. So the sudden involvement of these same private sector forces in a program touted to end the urban housing crisis was a recipe for disaster. This obviously did not mean that Black people should continue to be excluded. Rather, it demanded greater scrutiny, greater enforcement of the rules regarding the protection of civil rights, and specific plans to undo the practices that had resulted in Black exclusion in the first place. Without that level of scrutiny and the threat of behavior-altering punishment, there was nothing in place to prevent the continuation of these practices. Instead of scrutiny and regulation, predatory practices continued. In other words, the racist exclusion of African Americans gave way to their predatory inclusion. The notion of risk facilitated the charade of race neutrality as neighborhood conditions and financial insecurity of African Americans that had been created by the racist actions and behavior of government agencies, bankers, and real estate brokers were now twisted into evidence that African Americans should be treated cautiously in the marketplace. Predatory inclusion described the different, more expensive, and ultimately exploitative terms upon which Black people were admitted into the world of conventional real estate practices under the guise of colorblind neutrality. In reality, decades of color-conscious exclusion created poverty and the conditions of dilapidation and deterioration in working class and poor Black communities that then became visual proof that these neighborhoods, and most importantly, the people who lived in these neighborhoods, posed a risk to property values and loan repayment. More generally, predatory inclusion described the ways that African Americans were welcomed into institutions and practices from which they had been formally excluded because there were new, supposedly colorblind ways in which they could be extracted from or financially exploited. In the supposed colorblind, race-neutral American marketplace, Black investment in the housing market could result in credit-shattering, insurmountable debt with no hopes of their homes gaining value over time. This, of course, did not mean that the homes of Black people had no value. Black housing, even in its greatest distress, could be a fortress of refuge, places of communion, and sites of connection. But rarely was it the financial asset that it had been for millions of white people. But it was this issue of value that so much of the housing market turned on. The key to the American dream of homeownership was not just simple possession of property, but just as important was whether the value of that property would rise over time, increasing the owner's equity. In a society with an anemic social welfare state, such as this one, the boost in home values were determinative of one's quality of life. The ascending value of a home could help finance a college education, an unforeseen financial crisis, or contribute to a comfortable retirement. But homes did not ascend or descend in value on their own terms. The surrounding neighborhood and the value or lack of value of other buildings, businesses, and other institutions helped determine whether a neighborhood was good or bad. In the United States, value was also shaped by whether a property owner was white or Black, surrounded by other white people or surrounded by Black people. There is a perception in our society that value is intrinsic, tangible, real. We know what has value when we see it just as clearly as we understand the lack of value when we see it. But in this way, value within the housing market was socially constructed, a strange alchemy of race, place, and the perceptions of the buying public. Or as sociologist Dalton Conley put it, property values are where culture meets economics. Frederick Babcock, considered an originator of real estate appraisal, wrote in his seminal book, The Appraisal of Real Estate, quote, "It is obvious that there is no absolute ironclad method of computing real estate values, because values are a social phenomenon dependent upon human behavior. The intensely subjective process of determining the value of property or a neighborhood, or what I would call the pseudoscience of real estate appraisal, was inherently informed by the presence or absence of African Americans. The American Institute of Real Estate Appraisers said as much when its professional manual maintained into the 1970s, quote, "The clash of nationalities with dissimilar cultures contributes to the destruction of value. When a new class of people of different race, color, nationality, and culture moves into a neighborhood, old inhabitants think that the neighborhood is losing desirability." Thus, the intensity of anti-Black racism in American society was inevitably wound into these notions of property value, neighborhood, and community value. The assumption that Black people were harmful to property values drove the desire to keep them segregated. It justified their marginalization in the housing market. It offered a common sense explanation for the disproportionate conditions of dilapidation, distress, and substandard housing, largely owned by whites but rented to Black people. This difference in value in white housing compared to Black housing produced a tension between exchange value and use value in housing, or more intimately, the difference between real estate and a home. These contradictory objectives of real estate and a home, one a commodity and the other intimating a place of belonging, also reinforced reactionary racial norms and deepened the perception of dual housing markets working at dual purposes. Mid-century narratives of normative whiteness embodied in conceptions of the suburban-based nuclear family shaped the perceptions of home as an expression of use value within white communities. Conversely, developing narratives concerning perceived domestic dysfunction within Black living spaces, whether that constituted non-normative family formations, poverty, or dilapidated living structures, cast Black dwellings as incapable of achieving the status of home, thus reducing them to their base exchange value. Where white housing was seen as an asset developed through inclusion and the accruable possibilities of its surrounding property, Black housing was marked by its exclusion and isolation, where value was extracted, not imbued. These racialized narratives of families, communities, and their built environments reinforced and naturalized the segregative practices among real estate brokers, mortgage bankers, and the white public. Indeed, these perceptions of insurmountable difference, steeped in the permanence of blood, race, and culture, constituted the underwriting criteria that determined who was to be excluded and who should be included. In this way, segregation was profitable. Value accrued to white housing the further it was from African Americans and their neighborhoods. But value could also be found in segregated and distressed housing for African Americans. Only the value did not flow to the Black homeowner. Black people functioned as vessels through which capital flowed from enclosed Black neighborhoods out to banks and real estate operatives. Real estate confined each group to its own section of a single housing market to preserve the allure of exclusivity for whites while satisfying the demand for housing for African Americans. This was evidence not of a dual housing market, but of a single American market that tied race to risk, linking both to the rise and fall of property values and generating profits that grew into the sinew that bound it all together. White housing and white neighborhoods did well because Black housing and Black neighborhoods were robbed of federal subsidies and guarantees. A white housing market would have actually been unintelligible without its Black counterpart. Both relied on the other to make each legible. One could not have existed without the other. This reality exposed the thinness of American liberalism, where inclusion alone was offered as a palliative to the rigid structures of white supremacy that held the market, the governing institutions, and the law itself together. The collusive relationship between the public and private sector in the production of public policy, housing policy, undermined the potential for inclusion to make meaning of Black citizenship. This became starkly clear with the new Housing and Urban Development Act of 1968. Consider the experiences of Janice Johnson. On September 18, 1970, Janice Johnson bought her first home in Philadelphia with a mortgage guaranteed by the Federal Housing Administration. By all previous standards, Johnson was an atypical buyer. She was a Black single mother on welfare and living with her 8-year-old son in a decaying apartment in a building that had recently been condemned by city officials in Philadelphia. Now facing eviction, Johnson needed to quickly find a new place to live when she found an apartment for rent in the same neighborhood. Johnson called the landlord in anticipation, but her hopes were dashed when he told her that he could not rent her the apartment because she was a welfare recipient. The landlord quickly pivoted from offering a rental to suggesting that Janice Johnson buy a house in that same neighborhood. As a welfare recipient, she qualified for one of HUD's new low-income homeownership programs. And within a matter of days, she was able to purchase the house with an FHA-backed loan for $5,600. Within weeks, Janice Johnson realized that her home was not the fulfillment of the American dream. It was the beginning of her American nightmare. Within days of moving into her new house, the sewer line broke, spewing wastewater all over the basement floor. The electricity for the house was sporadic and haphazard. There were holes and other irregularities in the foundation of the home. The compromised structure of the house was not the worst of it. On Halloween night, Johnson's son woke up to find a rat in his bed. Janice saw rats throughout her house, including in the kitchen and bathroom. She called the agent who sold her the house to complain about its condition, and he sent workmen out on a couple of occasions, and they even patched the falling plaster in her dining room. But soon after, the real estate agent reminded her that the problems in her house were now her own. They were what he called homeowner's business. Miserable and dangerous housing conditions like these in the existing urban market led people like Janice Johnson to walk away from their homes that they had recently purchased. And the numbers of defaults, foreclosures, and FHA insurance payments began to rise. By the end of 1973, in one of the particular homeownership programs, there were multiple programs that were created by the HUD Act. 10% of homes in this one particular program were in foreclosure. By May of 1974, HUD was in possession of 78,000 single-family homes that had been foreclosed upon, and there were tens of thousands of others that were in a state of default, meaning that they were 2 or 3 payments from falling into foreclosure. Congressional investigations into impropriety in the homeownership programs showed that federal appraisers were taking bribes and inflating the value of dilapidated houses by 3 or 4 times their actual worth. Local mortgage bankers were also accused of accepting bribes to ignore inconsistencies in paperwork in order to approve even more loans. Newspaper reports and hundreds of federal indictments identified local FHA appraisers, real estate agents, and mortgage lenders as all involved in the swindle. These were not only scandals, but crimes that had been committed against poor and working class African Americans. In cities as diverse as Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, Seattle, San Jose, California, and Columbia, South Carolina, real estate brokers, FHA officials, and mortgage bankers were arrested and indicted for a criminal conspiracy to commit fraud. By 1974, 28 HUD officials had been indicted in their role in the housing scandal, along with other mortgage bankers and real estate brokers. By the end of that year, the FBI had 1,930 open, active investigations into claims of fraud in HUD's homeownership program. The crises in the programs coincided with an end to the long post-war economic boom that had been the foundation of the American dream. Instead, by the end of 1973, unemployment was on the rise, as was inflation, creating the economic conundrum of stagflation. The onset of recession, the deepest since the 1930s, created a political opportunity to roll these programs back by stoking the racial resentment of white suburbanites and the perception that these programs were for undeserving African Americans. This opportunity helped to shape the political climate that allowed the Nixon administration to implement their long-held plan to shift power back to the states when it came to the distribution of social welfare. The overriding objective was to unravel the Johnson welfare state and replace it with revenue sharing, block grants, and a devolved role of the federal government, while promoting an agenda of local control for the distribution of social welfare funds for cities and states. While there had been bipartisan support for low-income homeownership, the mounting scandals were becoming a political problem. Advocates and other elected officials also argued that there should be less emphasis on existing housing and more of a focus on building new homes in cities to give African Americans more and better and cheaper housing options. This was certainly not in Nixon's plans, not after he had carefully cultivated the white silent majority coalition of disaffected white suburbanites who fought to keep their suburban communities white and exclusive. The growing spectacle of scandal and mounting foreclosures within the HUD homeownership programs generated the momentum for the right to attack these housing policies. The political attacks were, of course, not confined to housing alone, but the entire social welfare state came into question. These programs had largely been won in part due to the insurgent Black movements that had helped to redefine Black poverty and inequality to the exclusionary policies of the state, rampant discrimination, and capitalism itself. From the March on Washington, which insisted on jobs and freedom, to Malcolm X connection between capitalism and racism, to Stokely Carmichael coining the phrase institutional racism, and to the Black Panther Party's anti-capitalist and anti-colonial framing, the Black movement had clearly identified the foundations of Black inequality, and more importantly, the need for programs that addressed the structural inequality that it was a result of. So to effectively undermine these programs are a naive exercise in social engineering. As an Ohio Congressman, Thomas Ashley tartly argued, quote, "You cannot run a middle-class program in the ghetto." Members of Congress and news reporters turned their attention to the poorest participants in the program, Black women on welfare like Janice Johnson, who had been aggressively targeted to become homeowners. These women, many of whom had been recruited from deteriorating public housing complexes, were particularly vulnerable to buying homes that were in poor condition because they were desperate for housing for themselves and their children. But when questions surfaced about the condition of their housing as an act of self-preservation, HUD investigators linked the distressed housing to the homemaking skills of Black women. In one hearing in 1970 to discuss the growing problems in the homeownership programs, HUD Secretary George Romney, the former governor of Michigan, complained, quote, in the case of lower income families, you have many who have not had the responsibility of homeownership previously, and therefore there is a greater tendency on their part not to undertake the work necessary to maintain a home. Some officials were even more explicit in their attacks. Georgia Congressman, a Republican, Ben Blackburn, said, quote, "The problem is that we have been putting families into homes who have no sense of responsibility of home ownership. And that is where the problem has been, and that is the intrinsic problem with the program. We found welfare mothers whose sole income was aid for dependent children, plus other benefits that come from that status in life. And they were put in housing as owners, and yet they could not even fix a faucet washer. Have we concluded that there are some people who should not be put in the status of home purchaser? Can we not conclude that there are some people who do not have the responsibility to own a home? Of course, there was the undeniable irony of the rich white men of Congress who relied upon Black women as maids and caretakers for their families, now complaining about their homemaking skills. But there was a larger issue. Focusing on African American women's housekeeping abilities deflected attention from a more pressing question of why the FHA and HUD were insuring properties that were in uninhabitable condition. After all, an earlier audit of HUD's homeownership program concluded, quote, "No homeowner can be expected to cope with poor construction, cracked foundations, improper wiring, and a general failure of contractors to meet local building and maintenance requirements." It is important to say that Black women were not just victims of this kind of abuse, and it was their willingness to seek out help and use the resources of legal aid societies to engage in litigation that the criminal aspects of these programs actually came to light. By the mid-70s, especially in Philadelphia, Black women were at the helm of important grassroots organizing efforts to make HUD and the FHA fulfill the promises to repair the broken houses that had been sold to them on the watch of these organizations. Other activists also rejected this kind of victim blaming. One homeowner turned activist in Chicago described the devastating effects of HUD's failed programs as, quote, "the outright murder of our neighborhoods in America, aided and abetted by the Federal Housing Administration, the mortgage industry, the insurance industry, and the unscrupulous real estate industry. These four institutions are working together to systematically destroy what's left of America's cities. What for so long has been considered a natural phenomenon, changing neighborhoods, deteriorating cities, are not natural. It's an outright plan, and the government, the realtors, and the big money people are making lots of money out of changing neighborhoods, out of the communities that we call home." But Nixon officials were able to use the spectacular fraud and corruption of HUD's homeownership programs as evidence that the government should get out of the business of housing poor and low-income people. The highly visible collapse of the low-income homeownership program not only raised questions about the role of the state in housing people, but it also allowed officials to gain support for continuing to keep poor and working-class Black people out of white suburban communities. In January of 1973, in his last act as HUD secretary, George Romney announced a national moratorium on the construction or funding of all federally subsidized housing programs, including all of the FHA-assisted low-income homeownership programs. Months later, Nixon would tell Congress, quote, "All across America, the federal government has become the biggest slumlord in history. Leaders of all political persuasions and from all levels of government agree that the federally subsidized housing approach has failed." Instead, he suggested, quote, "Of the policy alternatives available, the most promising way to achieve decent housing for all of our families at an acceptable cost appears to be direct cash assistance." This was the beginning of the federal turn to Section 8 housing vouchers, first issued in 1974. The introduction of vouchers was coupled with a demand from the Nixon administration that the existing housing stock be utilized for low-income housing. Existing housing was understood to be in cities, further cementing the racial division in low-income housing. Meanwhile, the Nixon administration secured $3 billion for the construction of new low-income homes that were all but guaranteed to be built in suburbs and largely reserved for white residents. With existing housing in cities for Black renters and new construction in the suburbs for white buyers, Nixon's segregated vision for housing in the United States was fulfilled. In closing, when Ronald Reagan became president in 1980, he called for HUD to convene a special commission on housing policy. For more than 30 years, the federal government had pledged to provide decent homes for its citizens, and it had failed. The latest housing commission paneled by Reagan called its report "To House a Nation," and it began with a criticism of the 1968 HUD Act. The HUD Act had left as its legacy, quote, a belief in the potency of government programs. Reagan's Commission on Housing promised the opposite. Quote, the genius of the market economy, freed from the distortions forced by government housing policies and regulations that swung erratically from loving to hostile, can provide for housing far better than federal programs. It was a conclusion that could only be reached by ignoring the actual origins of the HUD Act and the reasons behind its demise. Lyndon Johnson had also promised to unlock the genius of private industry as the key to ending the mystery of perpetual housing crises. But lackadaisical management, erratic regulations, and trenchant racial discrimination, combined with the end of redlining and the predacious inclusion of formerly excluded Black urbanites, allowed the real estate industry to bleed inner cities dry. It was not government intrusion that sank the FHA-assisted low-income homeownership programs. It was government negligence. But this malfeasance was not just an issue of poorly motivated personnel. It was the outcome of mismatched objectives and impossible tasks. When public policies are guided by the objectives of private enterprise, as the HUD homeownership programs undoubtedly were, they are clenched in a dance of conflict. As magnanimous as the titans of business who argued for socio-commercial enterprise in the 1960s tried to present themselves, in the end, the objective of profit-making outpaced the necessity for safe and sound housing. One glaring reason for this spoke to the heart of the conflict. Real estate profits were rooted in residential segregation. Race was turned into profit. There is a tendency to view the post-riot city as trapped in the stasis of blight and inevitability of decay over time. But the late 1960s and the 1970s were defined by changing political, social, and economic dynamics, and the inner city was at the nexus of these processes. New financial instruments, such as mortgage-backed securities, produced an intense demand for more homeowners and more money for home financing, while lax oversight and regulation incentivized unscrupulous and predatory targeting of urban communities. Far from being a static site of dilapidation and ruin, the urban core was becoming an attractive place of unparalleled opportunity, a new frontier of economic investment and extraction for the real estate and banking industries. The race for profit in the 1970s transformed blighted urban space into what U.S. Senator Walter Mondale described as a golden ghetto, where profits for banks and real estate brokers were never ending, and shattered credit and ruined neighborhoods were all that remained for African Americans who lived there. These are not just important historical lessons, but they have direct bearing on the communities and neighborhoods we live in today. Housing policies over much of the 20th century, and certainly the housing crisis of the 1970s, contributed to the uneven development of Black urban and suburban communities compared to white urban and suburban communities. The geographic scars created by the HUD crisis, where nearly 80,000 single-family homes were repossessed, but hundreds of thousands of more multi-family units also went into foreclosures, exacerbating a crisis of abandonment that animated the optics of distress and dilapidation. A generation later, these conditions became the basis for designating a place and the people who lived there as subprime. For more than 50 years now, the private sector has been viewed as the most capable of ending the persisting urban housing crisis. And yet, these crises have become more stark over time, creating even greater degrees of housing precariousness. This is especially true in the realm of homeownership. The acceleration of subprime lending in the atmosphere of deregulation in the late 90s and the early 2000s resulted in unprecedented home losses for African Americans. The practice of subprime lending was contingent on racial practices and assumptions across the housing industry and among the general public. The cascade of foreclosures and mortgage defaults further eroded the value of properties in Black communities, once again hollowing out the notion of homes as assets for African Americans. The net loss of more than 240,000 houses for Black people has created the pretext for mortgage lenders to once again engage in exclusionary practices that marginalize potential Black homeowners. But this is only one aspect of the crisis. The recurring perception of risky Black buyers has opened pathways for the reemergence of naked, predatory practices in the real estate market. From rent-to-own schemes to the reappearance of land installment contracts in lieu of conventional mortgages, real estate continues to pilfer Black people in search of their American dream in the housing market. But this is not history repeating itself. It is the predictable outcome when the home is a commodity and it continues to be promoted as the fulfillment and meaning of citizenship. Thank you.
So there will be two people walking the steps with microphones. So we'll take questions from the audience. Just raise your hand and then wait until the microphone comes to you. I think I will take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question. First of all, thank you for the talk. Thank you for the book. I have been teaching housing policy for 30 years, and this window of time that you have focused on is one that all scholars and historians know about, but few have actually written about in depth. And so we're very thankful to have this book.
Thank you.
For us to ponder. My question to you is how would you characterize the failure of the FHA Homeownership Program? A failure of too much privatization, or a failure of government oversight?
Well, I think it's both, and I think that they're related to each other. I don't think that they're distinct problems. I think that one of the things that I'm interested in looking at is how the relationship, sometimes collusive, sometimes something less than collusive, between public and private sectors, then inevitably produces public policies that bend to the will of the private sector. I mean, I think that there's a century worth of examples to point to that. And this housing program is just one aspect of it. And so, I think that part of the problem was a complete abdication of any responsibility for regulation and oversight. But then when you look into why that is, you can see that because the federal government has almost completely outsourced its responsibility to producing housing to the private sector, that it's much less a partnership than the federal government is reliant on these private sector forces, which then undermines its ability to aggressively police what it is that they are doing. And so there are examples like that show that this tension between the two is very difficult to resolve. And, I think philosophically that there's a bigger problem, which is for real estate. And I try to stay pretty narrowly focused on real estate and to not make a lot of generalizations, though I think that it's easy to do, whether it's the distribution of water, healthcare, education, that the involvement of the private sector distorts the objective and the outcome. But in real estate, the objective of real estate whether you like it or not, it doesn't matter if you like it or not, is to buy low, sell high, and to increase your profit margin. The purpose of public policy is to protect the public's interest and the public's welfare. These two things do not match: profiteering and the public's interest and the public's welfare. And so the constant effort to merge those two, for me, is akin to trying to fit a square plug into a round hole. It doesn't work. And there are a number of failed housing policies, I think, that point to that. Even something like public housing, as you know, is deeply affected by the influence of the private sector. I mean, it's why it takes on a particular characteristic it does in this country, which gives people here the perception that public housing is just doomed to fail, when all over the world there is social housing that is paid for by the state, that effectively and comfortably houses people, that it doesn't have to be the kind of have the disastrous outcome that it did in this country. But even in something called public housing, there is a kind of subtext to the role of the private sector in distorting what that project could have actually been. So I think that it's both a failed policy, but it's a failed policy because of this influence and role of the private sector.
Okay. All right. Thank you. I have a question over there.
I'm very curious, in a sort of related to what you guys were just talking
I can't hear
about.
you.
Well,
Oh.
just speak up.
Related to what you were just talking about, and what this whole talk seems to talk about, looking at things like opportunity zones, which aren't just real estate. It's not just housing, but I'm very curious to hear your thoughts on sort of the ambiguity and the elusiveness of how opportunity zones will work, and how sort of revitalizing certain areas, which are, at least here, a lot of them are concentrated in the urban core, what that'll look like with that dichotomy going on between private market and government oversight.
You mean Trump's the opportunity?
This is it passed with the updated tax bill.
Yeah, I mean, this is a tax shell game. I mean, that's what it is, right? If you invest in one of these opportunity zones, you have to pay taxes for 10 years on capital gains. I mean, really? This is a program intended to transform it? No, I mean, come on. In Philadelphia, they have this ridiculous thing of tax abatements on property tax abatement on all new developments and all down to the stud rehabilitations on homes that leaches $421 million in property taxes from the city every year. You know, and it's these new properties that are advertised for rich people, these $1 million condos. And meanwhile, you literally have in the city of Philadelphia, the 5th largest city in the United States, public schools that have been closed in the middle of the year because there is asbestos poisoning. Teachers have been diagnosed with cancer related to asbestos in the building. So they've closed the school in the middle of the year. This is at 2 schools. And so the condition of, public schools are falling apart. Well, they're given, a 10-year tax break to millionaires. This is, and the Trump thing, in some ways, that's all you have to know, is that it was his idea. I mean, that should tell you something. But I mean, I generally think these opportunity zones, empowerment zones, are really tax write-offs for rich people. They're not about real investment. They're about throwing up some cheap business opportunity that they create, 16 part-time jobs with no benefits, and call that job creation. I mean, if we're, serious about the actually dealing with the level of inequality in this country, then we have to come up with serious prescriptions for that, which means taxing billionaires out of existence and really raising the amount of money and finding the sources of money. I mean, we spend almost $1 trillion a year on the Department of Defense. I mean, and the United States is infrastructurally falling apart. So there are many things that can be done, but I think that it requires having a serious discussion about what those things, what is actually required to do that, and understanding that, you know, it will be expensive, and stop trying to dance around that by coming up with cheap solutions to fix historic, systemic, deeply structural problems that were not created overnight and that require completely unearthing and redoing.
You do.
I have a question about what steps you would like to see taken in the near future to achieve socially just, affordable housing in the Twin Cities area.
Well, I'm not from the Twin Cities, so I don't know what should be done here specifically. But you know, I think that there are a few things that should be a part of the discussion. I think that if the one thing, and this was clear in the research for my book, is that there's never been a real serious commitment from the U.S. government to enforce its own rules and regulations regarding housing discrimination and civil rights violations within housing. For example, when the Fair Housing Act was passed in 1968, a civil rights division was created within HUD that was charged with the responsibility of enforcing the Fair Housing Act and stamping out issues of housing discrimination. And so, you know, the Congress appropriated $6 million for this effort, $5 million of which was to go to staffing, which left $1 million for 120 employees to oversee and follow up on complaints of racial discrimination in housing for the entire United States. And so on its face and in its origins, this is not a serious commitment to deal with issues of housing discrimination. And that it remains a real factor in terms of the lack of accessibility that African Americans have to the entire housing market, places downward pressure on the condition of Black housing and upward pressure on the price of Black housing. And so I think, and there's, you know, I was working on an article and I found there was a roiling debate in Houston, Texas about the placement of some low-income housing structure in this predominantly white middle-class neighborhood. You know, and as late as this was 2017, the people who were showing up to these local town meetings, you know, they're smart enough not to talk about the race of the people, but they were concerned about crime, and they were concerned about overcrowding in their schools, and they were concerned about cultural differences between them and these new people who would be moving into. I mean, this is a front page story in the New York Times. This is not, you know, some obscure incident. And so these things happen all the time, everywhere, and it dramatically limits Black people's access to housing. So I think enforcement of the Fair Housing Act is a good place to start. I mean, I think that it's difficult to talk about this in narrow policy prescriptions, because the policy prescriptions that are typically on offer are completely insufficient. And so I think that all of the public-private initiatives around affordable housing are too small, are too underwhelming, and are not sufficient to the enormous level of housing need that exists in this country. We're over 51% of the population pays more than 30% of their monthly income to house themselves. I think it's 18% spend over 50% of their income to house themselves. And so all of these, the programs that are created, are a few thousand here, a few thousand there, when what we really need to be discussing is housing for millions of people that is affordable. And in order to match the scale of what is needed, then the state has to be involved, and it can't just be offset to, a handful of public-private partnerships to figure this out. And so that requires a totally different approach than I think has been the dominant one for the last 40 years, for the last 50 years, which is to rely on vouchers and public-private partnerships to solve the crisis of affordability. And then we see every year it gets worse. So it might be a good time to reconsider that approach.
Hi. So as a low-income renter, I've historically been priced into neighborhoods that are in the process of gentrification. And through that experience, I've become more aware of my own privilege. So I was just wondering, do you have any advice for white prospective homebuyers in ways that they could be better allies in this process with acknowledging the issues that sometimes feel really out of control?
Yeah, I think, I think that part of the issue is how this gets framed, especially around gentrification. I mean, I think that for the most part, all of us are trying to find a place to live. And so much of the discussion becomes focused on what individual renters or buyers are doing, that we ignore the roles of banks and brokers and builders in severely constraining the choices that we have around housing. And so I think that it's important to be aware of, where you're moving and who's there and whose space that you're moving into. But it's all happening within a context of everyone is chasing cheap rent or chasing a cheaper place to live, because we are in a housing market in this country that is completely and unethically unregulated. And it has become like, healthcare, prescriptions, food. I mean, you have to have housing. And when you have to have housing and it's in a market where someone can put a price on it, then you end up with what we have now, which is wages and income doing this over 40 years, but inflation around housing costs doing this. And there's no correlation, between, it's like the cost of college tuition, right? Stagnant wages, stagnant income, and the tuition, magically multiplies every year. And that's the magic of the market, right? That's the invisible hand of the market working its magic. And so for me, that then leads again to how do we extricate ourselves from the tyranny of the market as a way to create real equality around housing, this thing that the human race actually can't survive without. And so that's not, to me, it's that it takes us away from the individual discussion of what should I do as a person moving into this or that situation, into what needs to happen collectively to transform how we even think about how to house people, how we think about these questions that kind of challenge the narrow way that we're used to thinking about them, which is in these very narrow policy prescriptions that have been hashed over and over again and are put in front of us as the only possible way of thinking about anything, even though we have half a century of their complete and abject failure. But we're supposed to continue to keep doing that again. So I'm suggesting that we think differently about these things. So in the same way that there is a different kind of discussion about healthcare, is healthcare a right that we as human beings have a right to have access to, regardless of what our income or how much money we have? I mean, this was an idea that was mocked in the presidential elections 4 years ago. Oh, you want free healthcare like you want free pony rides, I think was the mocking. But now it's a starting point for the discussion. Even if you don't like it, you have to have something to say about it. And same thing about education. We think that an educated citizenry produces, more information and makes for a better society. Well, then why are we paying for it? And so that's like free pony ride 4 years ago. Now it's a starting point in the discussion. Even if you don't like it, you have to have something to say about it. And I think that there's a similar opportunity to have that kind of discussion about housing and what do we do about this crisis that, is turning into a crisis of homelessness. And instead of dealing with that, you have local city and state governments trying to find new ways to punish homeless people, to remove homeless people so we don't have to look at them and deal with that, instead of trying to square the circle of, we have thousands of, empty units of housing that are just places where rich people stash their money and poor people living on the street. This is crazy, And so that means we have to think differently about these questions and not in the same ways that we're used to, because, those in many ways have run up against their limits and they don't work anymore. And I think more and more people are realizing that.
Who's got the microphone next?
Thank you for being here. I want to make you aware.
Where are you? This is like the disembodied voices. Okay, thank
I'm
you.
sorry. I would like to make you aware of something we've done in Minnesota to address some of the issues that you've discussed, and it really is an extremely complicated thing. About 5 years ago, the Minnesota Jewish Community Action Center started a project for responsible banking, and we promoted responsible banking ordinance to the cities of Minneapolis and St. Paul, which they eventually signed. In order to get that done, we needed to have data that we could present to the municipalities saying, this is what you need to be doing. We did a study. We started to do a study and found out it was way more complicated than we anticipated. We called upon the Humphrey School of Public Affairs to help us. They assigned a professor to help us. He and his team worked with us for about 6 months and put together a document that showed how people of color within the state of Minnesota get access to capital, especially real estate loans, mortgages, from the banks that do business in the state. There's almost 100 banks that do business within the state of Minnesota. We evaluated those banks based on number of minorities who applied for loans, mortgage loans, number that were accepted, the interest rates they were given, the number of people who requested modifications, and the number of people who were foreclosed upon. What we found is that of those 100 banks, only one bank could be looked at as being an outstanding bank doing the right thing for their community. Mm-hmm. The gap between number one and number two, and everybody else was immense.
Mm-hmm.
So one of the things we can do, if we could ever make this information public, because it is in the hands of the university here, is to show who is the number one bank doing business in the state and the gap between them and everybody else, and get people to think a little bit differently,
Mhm.
to move their money from these big mega banks and go to this one bank that is doing a good job. So I just wanted to make you aware that we are trying to address those issues. The responsible banking ordinance was passed in Minneapolis. It was passed in St. Paul. It made some changes, not enough, but we were able to get something done.
That's great. Thank you.
Many over here. Thought we had two.
Hi, thank you so much for your work and for being here tonight. As for the struggle for equitable housing in the Twin Cities area, I wanted to bring into the room the work of an organizing group of public housing residents who organize under Defend Glendale and Public Housing. They're currently fighting the Minneapolis Public Housing Agency on its myriad of plans to privatize its public housing stock through various programs, including RAD, and most recently, a HUD program, Section 18, disposition and demolition, under which they were recently, as of this fall, approved to restructure scattered site single-family housing that is currently under a declaration of trust as public land to use private financing to remodel the homes. Their argument is that this is still under MPHA, it's still public housing, and yet the residents are deeply concerned about the introduction of private financing into these homes. And from your work, I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit on this strategy that MPHA has taken and what you might see come of it as far as the relationship between private financing and public housing. Thanks.
Well, one of the things that I don't write, I think I make passing reference to, but there's a book. I think her last name is Thurston. She's a political scientist at Northwestern. And it's a book about homeownership. And one of the things that she looks at are this turn around ownership that happens in the 1960s. So the HUD Act is one aspect of this, but there's a whole series of efforts to turn to ownership as one of the solutions to the urban crisis. And so one of these programs is promoting buy your own housing project unit. And so it starts as a pilot program in low-rise housing projects in Mississippi, where the housing authority is encouraging Black women to buy their own public housing unit. And this becomes, that's sort of the pilot. This is a big push within Reagan's HUD, is buy your own public housing unit. And this is part of a larger critique that I make in the book about these kind of fantasies around ownership and the distorting impact of homeownership as an ideological aspiration within our society that would then make it seem somehow that if Black women in Mississippi can buy their own public housing unit, that is, the equivalent of them being a white suburban homeowner, that we're all homeowners in this society together. And so one of the things that I'm looking at is what does it mean to be in a society that hinges social mobility and access to the good life, to the ownership of this asset that is not either accessible to everyone, or even when it is accessible, that it functions differently for different groups of people. So one, the rate of Black homeownership is dropping precipitously. It's now at 40%, which is as low as it has been since the passage of the Fair Housing Act in 1968. So you're talking about, and 60% of African Americans are kind of excluded from this enterprise. But then you look at, well, even when Black people do own homes, that it functions in a completely different way. There are all sorts of studies that show the ways that Black housing in Black hands is valued less than housing in white hands. And that housing for Black families often functions as a debt burden, not as an accruing asset that then can be passed on intergenerationally. I mean, this is the one of the main basis of the racial wealth gap that we like to talk about in this country, and yet homeownership is constantly promoted as a way for poor and low-income people to build assets, to build equity without thinking about, well, where is the house actually located? Is that because of the way that segregation functions and the way that Black neighborhoods are valued? Is that even possible? And there are very stark examples of this. In Chicago, for example, there are in the 60653 zip code, which is Bronzeville, which is it's what one might consider the near South Side. You have homes that are worth between $400,000, $700,000 that are blocks away, like 3 or 4 blocks away from Lake Michigan. Those houses 5 or 6 miles north of where they are would be worth $1 million. And I'm talking about new construction. And so they're not $1 million because they're in a Black neighborhood. And this is the only difference between those houses on the south side and those houses on the north side. So that even when Black people have access to ownership, it functions in a different way. So that if you're a Black woman in Mississippi, you too can be a homeowner. You can own your own public housing unit, but there's no expectation that it will function in the same way that the home owned by a white suburbanite in an outlying area from where that woman lives, how that home would function. So the injection of those dynamics into what is supposed to be public housing, which is supposed to be removed from the market dynamic, so that these issues of cost and value are not supposed to then affect people's ability to live somewhere or stay somewhere, are completely undermined when that happens. And it's all with the ruse of there's not enough money. And so I think, again, that this is a sharpening point of ongoing conflict in terms of how are we going to seriously deal with the perpetual housing crisis. I said in an interview, I don't think we can keep calling it a housing crisis if it is perpetually in this state. This is more chronic than crisis. And this is a feature of what it means to have housing that is on the market. And so it kind of gets into these larger debates about how are we going to deal with this chronic issue.
Thank you, Dr. Taylor. I am, unfortunately, we are beyond our time. So
I give
Uh,
really long answers.
So I do invite you all to stay and to thank Dr. Taylor.
Thank you.